Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our Living with Lions webinar series. I am Jessica Jansen. I'm the development coordinator for the Mountain Lion Foundation. Today, we have our guest, Michelle Nijhuis. She is the author of the book, Beloved Beasts, Fighting for Life in an Age of Extinction. She is the project editor for The Atlantic and a longtime contributor to High Country News. Her reporting has appeared in National Geographic and in the New York Times. After 15 years of living off the grid in Colorado, she and her family now live in Washington State. Welcome, Michelle. We are so excited to have you here. Hi, Michelle. How are you?
Sorry about that. Great to see you.
No worries. There's always tech issues in the Zoom world. So welcome. Thank you so much for coming. First of all, I want to say, as a conservationist myself and as an avid reader, these are two of my favorite things brought together, a book about the timeline of conservation. So I found it fascinating and sometimes overwhelming emotionally, and a very, very, very impactful book. So I do have some questions for you if I can go ahead and kick things off.
Please.
So there are many books about conservation, but how did you get the idea to write about the history of conservation?
Yeah, good question. I mean, you could say I've been working on this book for 2 or 3 years, but really I've been thinking about it for probably 25 years. I started out as a biologist and helping out on wildlife research projects mostly in the southwestern US. And so I was really up close with a lot of super contentious, even violent controversies over endangered species. And I noticed that those arguments were just totally out of context, out of the context of, what people had done in the past to protect other species, why people had chosen these species to protect. And then as I became a journalist, I noticed the same thing was true in all the controversies I covered. People just didn't have a sense of what had worked in the past, why decisions had been made in the past. And a lot of that was understandable, especially on the conservationist part, because they were, preoccupied with trying to save this really vulnerable species. But I started to think maybe it would be helpful to try and put together the story of conservation so that it was more than, I feel like most conservationist sense of conservation history comes from biographies of famous conservationists, of which there are a lot, but we don't have a sense of there was this movement that's preceded us and that conservationists are part of today, and that's evolved and is still evolving. And I wanted to tell that story in hopes that it would help us not repeat some of our mistakes and perhaps use some of what we've learned over the years about what works in terms of saving species.
So I guess you could say in part it was an educational process, but there's also probably a part of you that wanted to bring about conflict mitigation because of that contentious background.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I mean, I love history, and I was always fascinated by these characters from the past. So I was just naturally curious about the story of conservation. But I think, there was a part of me that was really bothered by just the depth of bitterness and, as I said, even violence. And we're seeing that today. I mean, in fact, some of the same actors who were at work back then in the 1990s in Utah and Nevada, the Bundy family and others are still active today. And it's so, those controversies are so painful and so divisive, especially in these small towns where, the communities are really so intimate with each other, or should be, that I felt like, there must be a way where we can get back to what we have in common, which I do believe is a sense of care for the animals we live alongside. I mean, you might have a hard time persuading someone who lives on the other side of the country and doesn't think much about conservation that the snail darter is important, for instance. But I think most people, if you really sat them down and said, look, do you want this species that you've grown up with to go extinct? The answer would be no. So I think that gap between the potential for common agreement, we don't want this species to go extinct, and then the reality of just how bitter these arguments have gotten really was something I wanted to try and address.
Excellent. So coming to that emotional place that we spoke of, how emotional was this process for you, and how discouraging or encouraging was it for you to see conservation laid out in front of you the way that it is in this book?
That's a great question. I mean, weirdly, I came out of it with more hope in the way that I hope people who read the book will feel. I'm certainly all too aware of the many threats that humanity is facing, that other species are facing. But I did find it inspiring that to be reminded and to learn, in a deeper way, that we're not starting from scratch. Of course, people have been conserving species on a local level since the beginning of human history. The modern conservation movement, which really built a global network of conservation concern and started about 150 years ago, has also learned a lot. We've learned a ton from the science of ecology about what species need. So we're not starting from ground zero every time we try to protect a species. There are successes we can look to and build on. And I found that hopeful I found it a dose of realistic hope, I'll put it that way.
I think I could agree with that. I think seeing it laid out like that, and you see that people have come before you, you are not walking that path alone. I do think that could be very hopeful. So it's really interesting to see it that way.
Yeah.
When you talk about the inspiration that you've been this longtime conservationist, is that why you were inspired to write that book? Or was there, you said you had thought about it for 25 years. Was there suddenly an urgency where we find ourselves in this moment, standing on this precipice? Did you feel the urgency to write this book now?
I think it was a slow build. I think I needed to convince myself that this kind of book would be useful to some people, and that it wasn't just that these weren't just questions I had. But yes, I think every story I wrote about conservation, I just felt like, I wish I could include more of what's come before, and I became increasingly frustrated also just with the way I and other journalists tend to cover endangered species issues, which is, X species is very endangered, it's about to go extinct, there's not much you can do. And I felt like, if we as journalists, and perhaps if conservationists, were talking about conservation in some slightly different, more historically informed ways, we would be telling stories about protecting ecosystems and the importance of protecting ecosystems, or the importance of protecting common species before they get endangered. And so I hoped that a book like this might open out those possibilities for telling other kinds of stories. I think we as journalists especially have kind of gotten addicted to the drama of endangerment and extinction, which of course it's understandable, but I think that those stories are numbing after a while. I feel it in myself. And I think that there are so many other stories that can be told about, what you do about coexistence with species that aren't about to go extinct, that might be doing quite well. How do we deal with that? So those are really interesting problems that have their own drama, and I think we should be talking more about.
Yeah, when I looked at, the breadth of your work, I saw a lot of your articles, which were wonderfully written. I saw them as vignettes, and then this is like the full motion picture. I guess is kind of how I saw it. And I thought that it was really great that there was an evolution within you as a writer, as you're working towards this full motion picture. So that was really beautiful to witness.
Thanks. It's nice to think as a journalist that there might be some continuity where we often feel like we're jumping from, crisis to crisis. So.
Yeah. When you wrote this, you specifically avoided terms like nature, wild, and wilderness in a book that's about conservation. How did that happen? Like, what was the thought process behind trying to omit those phrases?
That was a bit of a weird decision on my part, but it started out almost as a personal challenge, because it's always, I thought, oh, great, I'm writing a book. I finally get to, say what I want. I'm going to try to avoid these phrases that have always bugged me, because I mean, I feel like the English language is so inadequate when it comes to talking about our relationship with the rest of life, right? I mean, we talk about nature, but when we talk about nature, the implication is it's something separate from us. And so and just the very word carries that implication. And so I feel like when I wanted the book to be about how conservation has realized more and more that it's about building relationships, and those relationships include relationships between people and other species. And so to use the word nature seemed to almost undercut that message. Anyway, I thought I'm going to try not to use these words and see if I can get away with it. And then it turned out to be not that difficult. There was always, sometimes I had to jerry rig a solution, but there was often another, like a more specific term that I could use. Like, when I wanted to use the word nature, was I talking about other species, or was I what exactly was I talking about? It was usually not too hard to express that. So, and then I did find it just over time and in very small ways, just shifted my habits of speech and shifted my perception of the world. I just think it's so important for all of us to remember as often as we can that we are part of ecosystems, even if we live in the middle of a city, and that we do affect them and we can contribute to them. We can play a positive role in them too. And so it was just a small change of habit that I found to be an interesting and rewarding experiment.
I loved it. It actually helped me look at other things I was reading in a different light. It helped me conceptualize other things in a different way. And I think that's also part of conservation, is learning how to look at things in a different way that helps us get from point A to point B to point C. So I thought it was really, really fantastic.
I'm glad. I wanted to just add quickly that nature is one thing, but the word wilderness is so culturally loaded in ways that I think we as Americans don't always realize. I mean, it's a very US concept, and we have it's part of our legal system. So there's a legal definition of wilderness that other countries don't necessarily have. So talking about wild and wilderness, you may know what you're talking about, but your listener may not always know what you're talking about. So it's a matter of clear communication too, I think.
Right. Yeah. A great way to see it inclusively. So did you have a favorite story of an individual when you were writing this book? Like what was what you wrote down on the page the most engaging for you, and the thing that was most attached for you?
Well, I think I spent time with these dozen or so characters whose lives I tried to link together throughout the book. And I grew to like each of them in different ways, even the ones who did pretty terrible things. They all had moments of insight or brilliance that you could admire. I'll say that I loved learning more about Alder Leopold, because I've always felt like I just have always really loved his writing, which is amazingly, I think, stands the test of time so well. He was just an plain but eloquent writer. And I think he was so prescient about the role of humans in conservation. So it was kind of an older vision, but also a vision that was really necessary to the future, and that still is so applicable, even though times have changed so radically. So I really appreciated getting to know him better, in a sense, getting to spend more time at the Leopold Check in Wisconsin, spend time in the archives, which are amazing and will make you feel like you can never write enough because he was so prolific. But I also loved the other character who really stood out for me was Rosalie Edge, who was a suffragist, a rather wealthy Manhattanite who came to conservation rather later in her life, in the 30s, and really shook up the conservation establishment in just very kind of exciting and amusing ways. And I didn't know, even though after learning about her, I consider her really important to the history of conservation, I didn't know much about her at all. I knew a little bit I knew her name and that she'd founded a particular sanctuary, and I knew a little bit about her personality, but I didn't know the details of what she'd done. And and her personality is so strong that it really, just leaps over the time it leaps over time and distance. So you really get a sense of who she is.
Yeah. And for those who are watching right now and who have not had the opportunity to read the book yet, one of the most engaging parts of the book are these stories about these individuals that you really do, like you said, connect with on almost like a familial level. And so I encourage people to not only read this book because of the vast amount of information that we really need to be absorbing about this particular subject, but also because these individuals are so fascinating, and they're individuals that, like you said, I didn't know much about some of these individuals before reading. And so I think that's a really valuable thing to walk away with, is knowledge about some of these, key players, so to speak. So when we talk about these individuals, tell me about Eleanor, which was a new name for me. I know a new name for a lot of people, and how your own thoughts about conservation seem very aligned with hers. And can you tell me a little bit about her as a person and the relationship that you sort of developed with this character as you're learning about her and writing about her?
Yeah, Eleanor Ostrom. She's not a huge presence in the book, but if I had to pick one character who I wish I could, send home with everyone who read the book, it would be Eleanor Ostrom, because I feel like what she has to say about conservation is still just so relevant and is so often forgotten. So Eleanor Ostrom was not a conservationist herself. She was a political scientist and an economist. She started her career in the late 60s. She won the Nobel Prize shortly before her death in the early 2000s. And but she's not very well known, even in her own field, and she's certainly not well known in conservation. But she was pushing back against this idea of the tragedy of the commons, which I'm sure everyone has heard the phrase, the idea that without state intervention or without privatization, people who share resources, whether those be trees or fish or water, will just pursue their individual benefit until the resources are used up. And the idea that this was inevitable was proposed by an ecologist named Garrett Hardin in the late 60s. And it has really stuck in the minds of many people, including conservationists, I think because we experience tragedies of the commons, small tragedies of the commons every day. If you go to a park that's full of dog poop, it's, you're walking through the tragedy of the commons and thinking, oh my God, people are just terrible and selfish. But Eleanor Ostrom was doing her doctoral work when that paper came out about the tragedy of the commons. And she was like, well, I'm studying a group of water users in Southern California where water is really scarce, and they're doing just fine sharing, figuring out this a complicated but workable system to share their resources. And she spent most of the rest of her career documenting communities and societies that had worked out systems for sharing resources that didn't involve state intervention or any kind of radical privatization. And that helped, I think, slowly and quietly has helped that kind of work, and the response to it has started to unseat that idea of that the tragedy of the commons is inevitable in the minds of many conservationists. And there has been a real recognition among large conservation institutions that they need to look to the work that's being done by community-led conservation organizations, whether those be here in North America or in Africa or elsewhere in the world, that are reviving older systems of managing resources, that are inventing new systems that work at a community level. And those, I got to visit a community led nationwide conservancy movement in Namibia as part of the research for this book. And it was so memorable for me because I saw a system that was helping people not only protect species from people, but support people in living alongside species, which I know is so relevant to your work, because they were living with lions, different kind of lion, but they were living with lions and elephants and species that can be genuinely troublesome. And they had borne the burden of conservation and felt like, conservation isn't doing us any favors. We just have to deal with these animals. And the community governance had allowed them to realize some of the economic benefits of conservation and also some of the practical benefits. They were able to work together to improve coexistence. and that had led to a real reawakening of connection and care for species, and a real pride in their conservation. So I think I had been looking, I talked about how those divisive battles over endangered species in small towns in the Southwest had really bothered me so long ago. And it wasn't until I went to Namibia that I actually heard a community talking about protecting species and starting with a common agreement that, yeah, we want to do this. We just have to figure out how to do it. And that to me really spoke to the power of these community-led efforts to overcome the tragedy of the commons.
Since you brought up Namibia, I actually lived in Namibia for a short time. I did. And one thing that I remember carrying with me from my time in Namibia was that I was told, and please correct me if I have misinformation, but they're the only country with wildlife protection written into their constitution. Yeah, so I think that what they may have to show us could be very important. And I wanted you to touch a little bit on some of the projects that you saw going on over in Namibia, what those projects were, and how you're seeing them now start to crop up in other places. If you could talk a little bit about Namibia.
Yeah, well, it's a young country. It gained independence in 1990, and before it gained independence, there was a small informal effort to reduce poaching in northern Namibia, where there was a lot of poaching of rhinos and elephants, and then smaller game species, by helping, these were regional conservation groups were working with communities to help the communities hire local residents as unarmed game guards. And in exchange for, a small ration of food. This was a very grassroots kind of effort in the beginning. And it really worked well, because the game guards had the trust of community members, and then community members, tended to inform them, oh, there's a strange person in, the loudmouth at the bar that you should know about. What's this guy doing in town? And so they were able to discourage poachers quite easily, and also the presence of the game guards discouraged local residents from accepting money from the game guards for information, because they knew their neighbors were working together to try and prevent poaching. So it really cut down on poaching in the region. The species that were being poached started to recover. And then, so when Namibia gained independence, they recognized the success of this model, and they expanded it nationwide into a system of community conservancies, which again are these community level entities that return some management power to the grassroots, where it's really been missing since colonization, where national parks and national governments really disrupted the traditional management that was going on in many of these places. So it's complicated. I would never, I don't want to claim that it's solving poverty or climate change, or even that it's solving conservation. And it's taken a lot of work over really a generation, but the results are amazing. And there's still very little poaching of rhinos, even though there's now an epidemic of poaching, as most people probably know, an epidemic of poaching for rhino horn in Southern and Central Africa. There is very little in northern Namibia, because the game guards are still working. And the local management of game species and the work on coexistence at the local level has also protected elephants and lions, other predators, and sustained game species. So it's allowed people to get to hunt and get protein, and also to make some money from tourism, from commercial hunting and from commercial tourism. But it's done at a level where that use is sustainable, and people really care about making sure that it's sustainable. So yeah, I found it, and I should say, as you said, it's far from the only community-led effort. It's perhaps one of the longest running, and maybe it's one of the few that's truly nationwide. But there are similar efforts in Canada, Australia, Indonesia, and then throughout Africa, there are many similar programs that are doing also being quite successful at avoiding the tragedy of the commons. So I think we in North America have a lot to learn actually from those examples, especially when it comes to coexistence.
Do you think that we've lost a huge connection with animals when you look at a country like Namibia, who's so deeply ingrained in the success of their wildlife? Do you think somehow here in the States, we've somehow lost that deeper connection that makes us want to save these animals? Or do you think that we do actually love them as much and we're just still trying to find our way?
I like to think it's there. I mean, the stories I heard when I was in Namibia were about the early days of these community conservancies where conservationists who were living in the area would visit with communities, and they would say, you know, what do you value about the elephants? And they would say, nothing. You know, it's just that elephant over there is a pain in my neck. You know, how do I get rid of it? And it didn't take much when the community conservancies were set up, they didn't, you know, take away the occasional annoyances of living next to large animals, and they didn't, you know, they didn't make anyone rich, that's for sure. They didn't take away the fact that work is needed to conserve other species, but they reduced they reduced those burdens enough so that I think people's underlying desire to protect these species was revealed, you know, that they could say, oh, okay, now this, you know, this very annoying problem with my crops and this elephant that keeps showing up is solved. I guess they're okay, you know, and I think I like to think, I mean, of course, I'm oversimplifying a very long story there, but I like to think that the same thing is true of us. I mean, there's so much hatred toward wolves in the rural West. I know, having, you know, lived around it and covered it for many years. I don't know, of course, now much of that is exaggerated by disinformation, but there's probably a lot of that has to do with anger at government policies, anger at one's neighbor. There's so much of that has very little to do with wolves. And so I'm not saying it's easy, but I do think there's hope that we can get past those resistances and agree that we want these animals to survive and thrive.
No,
Alongside our own thriving.
yes, I
Yeah.
think that we can really appreciate that here at the Mountain Lion Foundation. The mountain lion is often villainized. It's often seen as a nuisance species. And so we do, one of our pillars of the work that we do is teaching coexistence and showing people that we do need these animals on the landscape to equally thrive and benefit from one another. So yeah, absolutely, we completely understand that. So let's see, is there more conservationists can do to alter our trajectory, or is the average Joe just as powerful when it comes to change? And what can both the conservationist and the average Joe take away from this book?
Well, I hope conservationists will take away several things, but I mean, I hope they will take away some sense of optimism. And also a sense of opportunity, because I feel like I know that the conservation movement for many years has overlooked the contribution of ordinary people who live alongside wildlife and has opted in favor of top-down solutions. Of course, I'm again generalizing, but this has been the general trajectory of the conservation movement. And recent generations have, as I said, more and more recognized that they need that global network, but they also need people involved on the ground in the everyday work of conservation, and that those people are, you know, that their ability and talent for managing species they live alongside has really been overlooked for a long time. So I think there's huge opportunity there, and there are many great examples I think that conservationists can draw from. And I hope that ordinary person who's just interested in how species might be protected or, cares about conservation but doesn't know much about it. I hope they take away the idea that conservation is about much more than preventing extinction. I think conservationists, professional conservationists know that quite well, but they don't always tell their supporters that. They tend to, and again, I'm speaking largely of large NGOs who will use charismatic furry creatures and their dire plight to raise money. And again, I think that that's totally understandable from a strategy perspective, and also from a practical perspective, because some of those animals are so terribly endangered. But I hope that conservationists will give their supporters a little more credit and start talking about what we really want out of conservation, which is to protect relationships, not just among endangered species, but among all species, including our own. So a greater awareness of what's possible in conservation is what I would love supporters of the movement to take away from.
I love that. So if I'm average Joe or average Jane, and I'm watching this webinar, and I say to myself, well, I don't have Michelle's background. I don't have Michelle's knowledge. How could I possibly be of any impact? I should let her lead the charge, and I should just kind of step back. That's not in any way true. You need those people just as much as you need people like yourself.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I'm just a book writer. And I hope I've made a contribution, but certainly this book is about people who have really done the work in the past. And I would say that people often have more opportunity than they think, because, as I mentioned earlier, we all live in ecosystems. And so I think sometimes people who think conservation is important often think, oh, nature, it's out there, it's far away, I can't do much about it. There's so much that can be done, that people can do at the level of their own household, but also not only that, but at the level of their city and town, promoting coexistence. I mean, more and more we're seeing people thinking and working on solutions for urbanizing wildlife, and thinking about ways in which people can live more sustainably alongside these species. And I just think that there's a great deal that people can do close to home, no matter where they live. And that has the advantage of they're being able to see concrete results in front of them and be able to talk about them with their neighbors. So I'm not saying, turn inward and ignore what's going on in the world, but see that what you're doing fits into what you might do locally, fits into a global context, and can matter at lots of different scales.
So was there any story you told in the book that really stood out to you as inspiring to you personally, and the one that gave you the most hope for the future of our planet? I know we all have our favorite stories, but what was the one that inspired you the most and made you think, okay, we can do this?
Well, there were several of them, but I'll mention one because it was one that I've told a lot of people about since in the years since I had this experience. As I was finishing the book, I had the chance to go visit a fisheries biologist at Virginia Tech, who is working on some very common species of fish that live in the streams around there. And he has learned through his research that these fish actually support dozens of other species of fish through this very unusual kind of nest building behavior. They build these giant nests out of pebbles and at the bottoms of streams. And so he took me out to see these streams, and it's very, this is not like Hollywood nature. This is a county park. People are jogging with their, walking with their dogs. I'm standing there with binoculars, close to this kind of ho-hum stream, and I look under the water, and it's like a coral reef. It's there's so many species of fish buzzing around these piles of rocks, and I mean, I literally cried out in surprise, and the biologist was laughing at me because he said, "See what I mean? These are common species, but they're so important." And this research has really made him start talking about the importance of common species. And he grew up in Ghana, where fish is fish are very important for protein. And he knows that the fish in tropical streams are very poorly studied. So his personal mission is to take this kind of research back to Ghana, where he grew up, and support research there, just in terms of finding out what's going on in these freshwater ecosystems that are very little studied, and learning about what these common species are doing and why they're important, because there's, other than a little work on endangered species, there's, as I said, very little known about those systems. So that gave me hope, just that that research is broadening its scope, and looking at these species that we may not ordinarily give the time of day to, or may just shrug our shoulders when we walk by, and really not only discovering their importance, but discovering their wonder, the amazing things that they do that we don't necessarily know about when we're taking a morning jog.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So we talked a lot about being impassioned as conservationists, the history of, conservation, and part of the reason why you wrote this book. People are so impassioned about this issue. What are some things that people have shared with you about the way the book has impacted their feelings and ultimately some of their choices?
Good question. I've heard from a lot of people in conservation who have been happy to, happy to grapple openly with the history of elitism and racism in conservation, which I talk quite a bit about throughout the book. The history of some of its blind spots and the effects that those blind spots in modern conservation still have on its strategy. I mentioned, the fact that modern conservationists have been dismissive for a long time about people's ability to manage species on a community level. I think those conservationists know that there are some skeletons in the closet, so to speak. They know that there are some people who have said reprehensible things or done reprehensible things who have also been important to conservation. But I think that that history has not been grappled with in a systematic way. And I think I've heard from a lot of people who have said, oh, it's really great to sort of see this laid out. It's almost a relief to see it laid out and kind of have a way to think about it and have a way to talk about it with other people, other conservationists. And then I've heard from people who haven't known a lot about conservation, and it's almost surprised me that they've run into the book. And those are some of the most satisfying notes that I've gotten from people who just write and say, I had no idea. I'd heard of Rachel Carson and I'd heard about saving the panda, but other than that, I had no clue. And wow, this turns out to be a lot more dramatic than I think. So I'm glad to have opened the door to people. I haven't heard, that it's inspired anyone to go pass a new law or or anything like that, but I'm waiting.
Not yet. Not yet.
There's time.
When we talk about these figures that have done great things for conservation, but there are some figures that have done great things for conservation and have not been great people, and they have not been inclusive, they have not been kind. How do we segregate the two? How do we take the action from the person? How do we divide that and digest that?
Yeah, it's something we're doing as a society a lot these days. I wrote an article for The Atlantic over the summer that was partly based on the book, but partly not. And it was called "Don't Cancel John Muir." And then the subhead was, "But don't excuse him either." And I think that kind of sums up my feeling about these figures, is that I think we have to be really explicit about the things they did that were not admirable, or, I mean, some, many of these stories are told in the book, but there were some real have been some real dark episodes in the history of conservation. And this, I'm not just talking about things that were okay at the time, but are now seen as not so great. I mean, these were things that were actually seen as quite reprehensible at the time. I think it's important to be aware of that, to be aware of that strain in conservation, that it tends to attract a minority of people who conflate protecting species with somehow protecting the quote unquote purity of their own race or culture. I don't at all want to paint the whole movement with that, but there's in every generation, there's a few voices like that. So again, acknowledge them, but I think I don't want to leave them out of the history book, because I think the work they did in conservation in many cases has important lessons for us. So I wanted to, I mean, this is not a history of Indigenous conservation practices, though I talk a lot about those. This is a history of the institutional conservation movement. And I wanted it to be both a history that celebrated its genuine accomplishments, but also was quite critical of some of the patterns that have been established over the generations. And I do think it's possible to do both. It's interesting to do both. None of us are black and white. Hopefully, most of us have more good in us than some of the characters in this book, but you know, we're all complicated, and we don't have to excuse those actions in order to learn from these figures.
Oh, I like that way of looking at it. We've talked a lot about the troubled history of conservation. Talk about how you think things are going to play out today. When we look at the past of conservation and the journey and how troubled it has been and where we are now, what do you see for the future of conservation?
Yeah, good question. And what I want for the future of conservation may be different from what, you know, we can realistically hope for. I do see that that conservation has been informed by ecology. It's gotten a lot savvier about what species need. And again, it's gotten a lot savvier about the need to protect these relationships, to work on coexistence as you're doing at the Mountain Lion Foundation. And I hope, you know, I think that things are moving in a positive direction, but as always, they aren't moving quickly enough in that direction. So I do see us talking about conservation that is very ambitious and works at a lot of scales, from the local to the global. For instance, the 30 by 30 initiative, if it manages to include Indigenous concerns in a genuine way and include Indigenous land rights, I think that's that could be just an enormously concrete and encouraging step forward, if it gets incorporated into the Convention on Biological Diversity in the coming year. And then I also see people working at a local level to do more than protect species from people, you know, to rebuild those relationships. That's the direction I hope that the conservation movement is taking. That's, you know, it's more inclusive, more positive about the role humans can play. I mean, of course, we can be incredibly destructive, but we can also play this really positive role that I think the conservation movement has ignored. So that's where I hope we're all headed. And I think we are headed in that direction. We just need to pick up the pace.
The planet has lost, and this is sort of a staggering statistic, the planet has lost 755 animal species and 123 plant species over just the last 500 years. And you've said in your book, people are still killing too many animals and destroying too much habitat. Do you feel, as it exists now, conservation is working for us at all, or do we need to completely reimagine where we're going?
I think it's funny. I mean, one of the things that I came out of this project thinking was, oh, we know so much, we can't give up now. Because I think there's such a, especially given the depth of the climate crisis, and then, you know, horrifying stories about biodiversity loss, there is such a feeling of apocalypse, and of inevitability, perhaps inevitability of the tragedy of the commons, but on a global scale. And I mean, I feel it myself sometimes. I remember being trapped in my house last summer by both wildfire smoke and the pandemic, and looking out the window and thinking, oh my God, we are not headed anywhere good. But I think we have to recognize that we have, you know, for more than 100 years, the conservation institutions have been learning and have been applying their knowledge, and conservation has really mattered. Conservationists don't take time to look back and say, oh, this and this and this species are species that we have that we wouldn't otherwise if not for our work. But some people have started to try and do that accounting, to try and tell that counterfactual story with good data. And there are measurable, the conservation has had measurable successes. And I think it's really important to remember that. So we know what to do. And again, as I said, we're not doing it fast enough, but the threats are in many ways are the same that they were 150 years ago. As I said, climate change will be a huge threat to many species, but what's threatening most species most immediately is not climate change, but loss of habitat, overexploitation, these familiar problems. And so we just need to keep at it, and do it on larger and more ambitious scales. So unfortunately, I wish there was a shortcut. I mean, I wish we could just make more animals in a lab or make more habitat in the lab. And there's a lot of, I feel like there's a lot of exaggerated interest in those kinds of solutions because people are like, oh, really? It could be easier, but unfortunately it's not easier, but we have the know-how.
So I think for a lot of people who don't walk the path of a conservationist, things can seem really grim. It can seem like we're in a pretty dire spot. But you, who has all of this inside knowledge, who has all this, introspective information on conservation, you actually seem very hopeful to me. I get an overall feeling of hope from you. Is that where you're at? You feel very hopeful?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the day. I don't want to mislead anyone. I have watched the talks at COP26 with a mixture of frustration and hope. But I also feel that there are very tangible reasons for hope, very tangible reasons to recognize that we still have many possibilities for progress. And I guess I feel a responsibility to keep my eye on those things. It's in some ways a conscious choice, right? Like I could go watch Netflix, and believe me, I've done plenty of that, but as we all have, especially the last year and a half. But I could lie on the couch and give up and say, oh, we're in the end times. But I just feel a responsibility not to do that, to recognize that there are still tools, and we have a responsibility to keep using them, trying to use them better and more ambitiously. And we haven't run out of them yet, and I don't think we will for a very long time.
That's reassuring to hear. There are often times when I think, what if we lose the lion from the landscape? And when I read this book, I thought to myself, is there enough that we can do to prevent ourselves from losing all of our beloved beasts, right? Because there are so many that are threatened. There are so many that we need to save. I want to ask you, what's next for you as a conservationist personally? We know we feel a lot of responsibility in the weight that we're carrying because of the situation that we're in. What's the next step on your journey that makes you feel like you're moving forward?
That's a good question. I'm looking at a couple of other book ideas, and actually I'm an editor at The Atlantic part-time, and I'm working on a series of features about climate change that attempt to talk about how we are already living with climate change and how our world will be changing as the climate changes. So we're trying to get away from the standard story of look how bad this is, look how we're not doing anything about it, and starting from there and going beyond that. But I want to wait to write a book that I hope will be helpful to conservation in some way. And so I need to think about that a little bit more, exactly what might help the movement going forward.
Do you think one day maybe in the distant future, you'll be writing a book about how we solved climate change, we solved habitat destruction, we solved, the destruction of our beloved beasts? Do you think, or do you hope that one day, years from now, you'll be sitting down to pen a book about how we saved it all?
Ha, I love that question. I don't think I'll live long enough to write that book. I look forward to, if there's a way of knowing after I'm gone that book is being written, I would love to know about it. I aspire to live long enough to write a book about how the tide has genuinely turned. Fingers crossed. I would love to write that book.
My fingers are crossed as well, and I would be the first in line to purchase and read it. Thank you so much, Michelle. I think, this has been so eye-opening for me from the time that I opened the book to sitting down with you and discussing issues that we know are incredibly critical. We know we need to kind of turn off the Netflix, step back, know that we need to do something, whether you are a conservationist or you are average Joe or average Jane. What I'd like to do now is turn it over to the question and answer so that people can maybe ask you some of those questions that they have.
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you. And thanks to all of you who are listening for doing what you're doing. You're doing the real work on the ground. So you're making a difference.
While we're waiting for some of those questions to come in, actually, I do have a couple of more if I can ask my questions really quick.
Of course.
One of them is, why does one species struggle while another recovers? How do we directly as humans have an impact on what species are thriving and what species we're seeing disappear?
Yeah, I thought a lot about that when I compared the situation of the bald eagle, which, as many people know, was close to extinction decades ago and is now thriving throughout North America, and the whooping crane, which also, as many people know, was close to extinction and remains close to extinction despite decades of really extraordinary effort and dedicated work on the behalf of many, on the part of many conservationists. And I think we do need to think about how we are picking and choosing species. And I think that there are some that respond quickly to our efforts and some that don't. And we just need to think about the reasons for those and think about why we value certain species and why we want them to survive. And I'm not at all saying that there are species that we should give up on because they aren't recovering quickly. I'm just saying, I think we need to be explicit about why we are valuing certain species and perhaps not valuing why we're investing a lot of money and effort into certain species and perhaps not as much in others. And there are all kinds of reasons why we might value species. We might value them for their place in the ecosystem, but we also might value them just because we think they're beautiful or they symbolize something to our society. So again, I think it's just important to be clear about that and be explicit about it as we talk about how to use our limited resources to protect species.
So I would imagine, a species like the mountain lion, which is an umbrella species, right, which benefits so many other species, that would be a species I would imagine you passionately would like to see preserved so that we can continue to have our balance.
Yeah, that's an easy one for me. I mean, I guess personally, I would always favor the species that I think have a role in the ecosystem or have the potential to have a role in the ecosystem. And I would be warier of species that are already so endangered that they require heroic measures to just keep on the planet, much less recover to health. I mean, I'm interested in protecting species, in protecting healthy populations and protecting species in abundance, not protecting species 2 by 2. That said, I do recognize I would never ask anyone to, let a species go extinct on their watch. And I do recognize why those efforts are underway and will continue to be underway. But I think it's, again, important for us to say, look at how much we can gain in all these ways, ecosystem services, connection of people with other species from protecting an umbrella species like the mountain lion, and protecting its habitat. And there are all kinds of advantages to the habitat that go well beyond the single species of the mountain lion.
Absolutely. And I want to remind our listeners and our watchers right now, we do have one question for the audience before I switch over to that question. I know it can be intimidating, this content and this type of information, but this is very much also a layperson's conversation. So please feel free to ask any question that comes to your mind. It doesn't have to be some great scientific ask. So I'm going to go ahead. Not at all. I'm going to go ahead and mute myself, and we'll go ahead to this question.
We have one question from Monica.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, hi, Monica.
Hi, was curious to learn if you've explored or mentioned the faith and traditions of different cultures as part of the conservation movement, either historically or current.
I didn't get into that deeply at all. I did look a little bit at, as I went through conservation history, I did look at the shock that Darwin's On the Origin of Species created in his own society, Victorian society at the time, in Darwin's time, was persuaded that humans were divine, and that they were apart from other species. And also extinction was a very unfamiliar idea. People didn't really think humans had the power to drive another species extinct on a global scale. And so when Darwin came along, it was a real challenge to Christian beliefs at the time. People said, what do you mean we're related to other species? We're supposed to be divine. And what do you mean we have this power to destroy other species? We're not supposed to be able to do that. So I looked at faith in that way, but I didn't look in any deep way at the differences in faith traditions in terms of how they approach our relationships with other species.
Thank you.
That was actually a really great question. I do have another question for you, Michelle. We're waiting to see if we have any final questions from the audience. There are probably a dozen things that you do in a day that impacts our environment, our wildlife on a conservation level. If you had to share even just a handful of things with our audience of what they could be doing on a daily or a weekly or a monthly basis, how can people make an impact that might help propagate change?
Well, I'm always hesitant to advise people about what they should do on an individual level, because personally, I feel like, while I do try to have a household that has a relatively small footprint, I always feel a little depressed when I hear that kind of advice, because the scale of it is so small compared to the scale of the problem. I mean, I vividly remember seeing An Inconvenient Truth in the theater years ago and welling up when they started talking about changing light bulbs at the end. So I do think those things are important, but I really think the most important thing you can do is to be involved with other people who are, whether that means joining an organization that you admire that's doing work on a global scale, or I think even better, working within an organization at a local level, because I think it's so good for the soul as well as being really meaningful in a practical way. I mean, we talked a lot about hope. We're working in times where our hope and our energy and our motivation is challenged on a daily basis. And I think you need to really deliberately build a community around you of people who care and who you can work with, and then feel like you're not just alone doing your recycling. Nothing against recycling, but I think that work can be lonely. Especially speaking, I can say I lived off the grid for a long time. I loved living off the grid, but I eventually felt that I wanted to be more connected with a community, because I felt like I could have more impact that way. I felt like the solutions had to be systematic, and it was great to feel like, oh, I'm not using my carbon footprint is really small because my entire house is off the grid. But I also was very aware that not everyone could or wanted to live that way. So more
Yeah,
connection, I would say.
it's fascinating.
That's not a 1, 2, 3 step, here's the solution, but I do think it's an important ingredient in whatever you choose to do.
I agree. And in your experience living off the grid fascinates me. I'm a Colorado gal. So I'm
right.
out here in Colorado, and we do have such beautiful lands, and we have, wonderful mountain lions here, and hopes for coexistence. And when I read about you living off the grid, I thought, was that inspired by your want to conserve more? I mean, that's a huge impact. Like you said, your carbon footprint is really, really low. Did you make that choice because that was your aim, was to reduce as much as possible?
A little bit. I married into my off the grid house.
Ah.
So there were, I had several reasons for living off the grid, but I was drawn to it for sure for that reason. I thought, this is so cool. This is so wonderful that we can look at these boat batteries in our bathroom that store up the energy from our solar panels, and we can see that we're staying within the amount of energy that's supplied to us by the sun. How amazing. And I think that those lessons have stayed with me. I mean, I think probably the biggest lesson I took from it was how comfortably a person can live on very little, given the right circumstances, given the right systems. If you have those, if you have access to solar power, especially if you have access to solar power that's tied to the grid. Again, if you're doing it as a community, it's much easier to access. And I think that's just given me a sense of possibility. Like, oh, you don't have to suffer necessarily. You can live quite, perhaps, without. I think that the things that I talked about that I missed most of all were a toaster and a hair dryer, which I can only use occasionally, and could occasionally get away with a little bit of hair dryer time. But so those were small sacrifices in an otherwise extremely well-appointed life.
That's amazing. We do have a question from someone who's unable to use their mic, so I will mute myself so Chelsea can go ahead and read that.
Yeah.
All right, so the question is community-based collaboration something that Americans have generally forgotten, or is it something that we have never known? And I'm speaking of the dominant culture, mostly white, and not the indigenous Native American cultures. And then she notes that there's the idea that you cannot be what you cannot see.
Yeah, it's it's funny. I've spoken to a lot of conservationists since the book was published, including people on other continents, and I often hear the U.S. just doesn't know what's going on in conservation in terms of community-led conservation. And I, before writing the book, I think I was aware of it as these experiments that were going on. It sounded great to me in theory. I knew it was working, but I had no idea that it was working at such a significant scale, for instance, on a nationwide scale like it is in Namibia, or that it had even been established for so long. And I'm speaking of modern community-based conservation, not the traditions that current efforts are building on. Those, of course, have been around for much, much longer. So I think I would love to see more stories about community-based conservation in the US. I would love to see conservation organizations that work both internationally and in the US. I would love to see them, trumpet their work and talk about how it works and why exactly it's exciting, beyond just beautiful pictures of people in Kenya doing great things with their pasture lands. I mean, I would love to see conservation organizations get into just how radical it is and what a challenge it is to what we see as these established conservation paradigms. And one other thing I'll mention quickly is that I think we do have many community-based conservation efforts in the US, they just tend to travel under different names. One example I really like is, many of you are probably aware of the armed insurrection that occurred in Southern Oregon in 2016, where some right-wing radicals took over the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge. The community, the local community really did not, they really opposed it. It could, I think what those people were trying to do was to divide the community, get the community fighting with each other, get some people supporting what they were doing at Malheur. But the community did not react that way, even though there's plenty of controversy within the community over resource issues. They were like, we don't want these guys around, get out of here. And one of the reasons for that was that there had been a long-term collaborative effort, a roundtable where people from different walks of life and government officials, different kinds of stakeholders had been in conversation for a long time. And they had built some of those kinds of trust of relationships, and they had built trust that I think is characteristic of community-based conservation. So it wasn't quite the same thing, but it was a similar approach. And I think it's important to remember, it doesn't have to include everyone to matter. You know, we don't have to the extreme left and the extreme right don't have to sit down at a table and agree in order for community-based discussions, community-based conservation action to make a real difference. So in this case, it got the majority agreeing that this kind of extreme behavior was a bad idea. And it was, I think, very important, far beyond that community, that they were able to stand together against that.
Thank you so much, Michelle. It's amazing. I'm going to go ahead and ask our guests one last time if they have anything they'd like to ask, either by raising your hand in the chat feature, or if you are unable to do so, you can drop your question in there for Chelsea to read to us. But if there is no one else, I would like to ask you, Michelle, what your parting comments are for me. What would you like to leave us with today?
There's so many things. I really appreciated your questions. And again, I want to thank people for coming and listening, and thank you most of all for the work that you are doing, whether it's near or far. It matters, and I'm sure you know, but if you don't know, there are a lot of other people out there who have been doing similar things. Many people who have preceded you, and unfortunately, and we can all hope many people who will come after you. So we just say, get out there and enjoy the species we live alongside, and remind yourself why you're doing what you do so that you can keep doing it.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle, for being with us today. And thank you for all our guests for joining us once again for our Living with Lions series. We enjoy having you all here, and we enjoy sharing with you all these different topics that are so important, not just the survival of the lion, but the survival of all of us. So thank you, Michelle, and thanks to everyone out there, and have a fantastic afternoon.
Thanks so much. Take care.